Welcome to the last day of instruction. I'm sorry, parting is such sweet sorrow, but it's been a lot of fun. I hope you had fun. I did. To continue the fun, wind up with fun, we'll talk a little bit about genetics of behavior. But first, since it seems like we're a little underrepresented. Okay, so last time we were here, we were talking about sex determination. We finished up talking about Caenorhabditis sex determination, looking at how flies and worms both use the number of X chromosomes to control sex. And we looked at some human mutants, specifically individuals with Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome, and how that told us that humans do something different in terms of how genes control sex than Drosophila or Caenorhabditis, flies and worms. So what is it about humans that causes sex? Quick review. Is it the number of X chromosomes or is it the presence and absence of the Y chromosome? Okay, it's the Y chromosome. One of the things, last day in class, I want to make sure I'm not misleading you. The Y chromosome is important. Believe me, the Y chromosome is super important and cool. And suave and debonair. But it's not actually the presence or absence of the Y chromosome, that whole thing that controls sex. It's not the Y chromosome. It's one gene that's on the Y chromosome that controls male sex. It's this gene called SRY. Stands for SOX9 related. And then you can decide what you think the Y stands for. It's a gene that's related to the gene called SOX9. It happens to be on the Y chromosome. It is the gene that initiates a genetic cascade that causes male development. It is on the Y chromosome. That's the only thing about the Y chromosome that's important for making males. Just this one gene, really. There are a bunch of other kind of important genes. There are a bunch of genes on the Y chromosome that improve male fertility, which is kind of important. But you don't even get to be male without this one gene, SRY. How do we know this? Mutants. So because we're human, I mentioned this a couple of days ago, because we're humans, sometimes when things are going on that we don't think is right, good or not, we go to the doctor. And the doctors, over time, identified that there were some human females that had Y chromosomes. SRY is necessary for male sex. So these females, when you look at their chromosomes, like we did at the start of the term, the metaphase chromosome spread, you look at the chromosomes, there's a Y-shaped, not looks like a Y, but there's a Y chromosome and an X chromosome, but I'm looking at a morphologically female patient. And then you turn to the phlebotomist or whoever drew the blood or the tissue and say, did you really take this sample from her? It's got a Y chromosome in it. It turned out that those patients, XY females, have mutations in this gene. So they don't have a functional SRY gene, they develop as females. We've also got males, phenotypic males, like me, well, maybe not like me, I don't know, that have two X chromosomes. Why did they become male? Because they have the SRY gene. So somehow the SRY gene got transferred onto an X chromosome inherited by these people, so they've got two X chromosomes, but one of those X chromosomes contains the gene that causes maleness. Crazy. So it's not just the Y chromosome in itself. It's not the whole chunk of DNA that's important for sex determination in humans. It's just this one gene. Questions about this? So you can take an XX mouse, you can inject, if we were to talk about transgenic organisms and GMOs, you can give it a copy of the SRY gene and XX mice develop as males instead of females. So in this case, there are two X chromosomes. One of them presumably would randomly inactivate. So you'd be like a normal female, right? We ended last class, I asked, to females, you've got two X chromosomes, but in every one of your cells, or almost every one of your cells, you've got one turned off X chromosome. which is exactly like a Turner syndrome genotype, where instead of having one bar body X chromosome, they just don't have a second X chromosome. How is that different? It's a big puzzle in genetics. So why is it that one X chromosome inactivated makes you female, one X chromosome missing gives you Turner syndrome?
So then is the male characteristic associated with the Y chromosome itself or on the SRY?
So SRY is the master sex-determining gene. It's the person that has that long line of dominoes, the person that tips over the first domino and sets off a cascade, a chain reaction. So SRY is that gene. It's the first thing that turns on a bunch of, SRY is a transcription factor, not surprisingly. So it binds to promoters and activates transcription of a bunch of genes that do all sorts of things, like make you develop as a male, produce testosterone, grow the right man parts, etc. I didn't just say that. Other questions? Yeah.
Are these individuals sterile?
Yes. At least the XY human females that have SRY. Because, as I said, there are a lot of genes on the Y chromosome that are important for fertility, testis determining gene, testis growth genes and so forth. So yeah, if you don't have the rest of the Y chromosome, you might develop as a male, but you would certainly be sterile.
Dr. Ross?
Yeah.
Is it the Y chromosome that codes to make the SRY gene?
So
Or is it the other way around?
SRY gene defines, so it codes maybe. The Y chromosome, our Y chromosome contains the SRY gene. So the SRY gene is part of the DNA sequence of the Y chromosome. That's how we define which chromosome is the Y chromosome. Maybe that's what you were asking in terms of encodes. So if our SRY gene moves to a different, by transposition or one of those intrachromosomal mechanisms, rearrangements we talked about at the start of the term, if it moves to a different chromosome, that chromosome essentially becomes the Y chromosome. So whichever chromosome carries SRY. Yeah, yeah.
For your slide, if you have a human that has the XX genotype, the only way they could be a male would have been if they had a translocation that changed that position of the gene into that X, so that they ended up with the XX genotype, but they still produce that protein that
Right.
makes them look like a male.
Yeah, so somehow they'd have to get that little fragment of the Y chromosome that contains SRY. So part of the Y chromosome, not necessarily the whole Y chromosome, has to be present. Fun being a genetic. Yeah.
Question. So if you have an XY female, does the Y or whatever's left of the Y without the gene become a bar body?
So does the Y chromosome become a bar body if you're a female but you're XY? No. So it's only X chromosomes that become bar bodies.
Okay, so
But if it's an XX, let's see, oh man, I don't know the answer to that. So if it's the XX individual that also has a copy of the SRY gene, presumably one of the X chromosomes would inactivate randomly. So for the rest of class, I want to talk about evaluating hypotheses for validity. Use this couple examples of behavior and how it relates to sex chromosomes. So the story I want to tell you is about supermales, which is not a real, it's a term that somebody coined a few decades ago. And apparently it has nothing to do with drops you can take to make you a supermale or anything like that. Supermales in genetics were defined as individuals that have two males that have two Y chromosomes. So they have an extra Y chromosome, hence the term supermale, maybe. So this is aneuploidy. They've got 3 copies of the 23rd chromosome. They're XY, and then they've got another Y chromosome. What do you think would happen to somebody who has 2 Y chromosomes? What sort of phenotypes do you think that would produce? If any, you could say none. How would you just?
More testosterone production.
So they might have more testosterone production. Anything else? Okay, I'm going to assume the rest of you think that there would be no change. But apparently some scientists, some geneticists, maybe had that theory, that these would be taller, bigger, stronger, and maybe more aggressive. Perhaps because of this hypothesis that having two Y chromosomes might make you produce more testosterone. So decades ago, this is not the earliest paper that talks about XYY syndrome, but males that have two Y chromosomes. It was before 1965 that geneticists started looking at incarcerated males in prisons. So somebody had this hypothesis that, yeah, maybe aggression has something to do with the number of Y chromosomes you have. And maybe if you've got two Y chromosomes, you'd be more aggressive, more likely to be convicted of aggressive crimes, more likely to be in prison. So this started a cascade of studies where geneticists went to different prisons in different countries and karyotyped the convicted males to look for, do they have any chromosomal abnormalities? So they found a couple of correlations in prison communities that, well, you can read it up here. So it starts off, it is well known that 1% of males in institutions for the mentally, this is written in the 70s, of course, it's definitely not PC, for the mentally subnormal are chromatin positive and that the majority have XY sex chromosome constitution. So there's some evidence in the field that something with your X chromosome dosage might predispose you to changes in IQ. And so these scientists all around the world started looking in their incarcerated male populations to see if there was some correlation between XYY and being being guilty of committing violent crimes. Yeah.
So, I think it was maybe in the late 1900s, there was a project where they tried to reproduce I think it was like genes from like really smart people, like PhDs and stuff like that. Can you pass on your genes from like being smart since you mentioned it?
So there is some evidence to suggest, I suggest you look into it, but there has been evidence to suggest that the X chromosome carries a lot of brain-related genes, brain development-related genes, which might be why if you've got one X chromosome but two Ys, there is precedent for maybe believing that there's a reasonable hypothesis that XYY individuals would have a lower IQ. In terms of eugenics and trying to genetically engineer smarter humans, I doubt it. So then we get to future studies. A couple of years later, after that previous one I just showed you, the previous one was published in Nature, one of the top scientific journals. This one in Science, the other top scientific journal in the world. Incidence of gross chromosomal errors among tall criminal American males. Better than being a smooth criminal, tall criminal. So they decided maybe because of Klinefelter individuals, XXY individuals, who tend to be a little bit taller than the average male, maybe they thought, well, XYY super males, maybe they are a little bit taller on average. So there had been some precedent in the literature for that. So people started going around US prisons and looking at tall male prisoners and asking if they have XYY or other sex chromosome abnormalities. So they identified that 1 in 11 subjects had sex chromosome aneuploidy. So about a tenth of the males they looked at had weirdness going on with their sex chromosomes. Look at that last sentence. All the aneuploid subjects were mentally ill. None had been cytogenetically diagnosed. So none of them, of course, knew in advance, especially back in the 60s, what their sex chromosomes looked like. This is the first time they had been karyotyped. So is this correlation or causation? Does the presence of an extra Y chromosome predispose you to being tall, having a lower IQ, being aggressive, or being convicted of crimes? What would you want to know besides these brief points that I've made? If you were going to believe this, right, so hopefully the authors of these studies looked at public populations of individuals that are not incarcerated and showed that there was a different incidence of XYY in short, non-incarcerated males. Because if those also had a 1 in 11 frequency, then there would be no point here. It would just be the prison population exactly reflects what's happening in the non-prison population. So then, recently, along come a few other investigators who suggest maybe it's not anything to do with aggression that causes these males to be incarcerated. So maybe it's not genetics that causes aggression. Maybe it's because these individuals, this is the left paragraph up there, the bottom line. Maybe it's because XYY males have lower IQs, that they're more likely to be caught for crimes they're committing, and that's why these populations in prisons are higher in frequency with XYY males. It's not because they're violent, it's because they're bad criminals. So in the end, a couple of years ago now, the most recent paper I found on this, and you should definitely, if you're interested in this topic, which I hope you are, you should definitely look at the Wikipedia article, which does a great job. Always look at Wikipedia first. Does a great job of summarizing the history of the study of XYY males, which I've just explained, a snapshot. The increased risk of convictions of XYY males might be partly or fully explained by poor socioeconomic conditions related to these chromosomal changes. So again, it might not have anything to do with the extra Y chromosome causing aggression or increased testosterone for that matter. I don't know if anybody ever actually measured testosterone levels in the XYY males. But genetics definitely plays a role in intelligence and in behavior. In this case, sex chromosomes that control it. So basically the point is that after a bunch of studies over the last 5 or so decades, the conclusion was that, well, XYY males really aren't more aggressive and they're not really overrepresented in prisons. And so all of this research could have been avoided, perhaps, had we had a good answer to this question. "50 years ago, was there a really valid hypothesis for why they thought to look in prisons for XYY males?" So Christian gave us one example of a hypothesis. So maybe the extra Y chromosome increases testosterone levels. But given that the Y chromosome only really the one important gene on the Y chromosome is what? SRY. So basically the question is, what does having 2 copies of SRY do to you? All it does is turn on other genes that are important in determining male sex. So it's unclear to me personally whether or not having 2 copies of the Y chromosome would do anything at all physiologically or otherwise to an individual.
How can they tell if there's 2 SRY? What if there's 1 SRY?
That's a great question. So if you've got 2 Y chromosomes, you assume that both Y chromosomes have SRY on, but you'd have to actually look to find out. You'd have to sequence the Y chromosomes and see, do both copies have functional genes? So this is maybe a good example of a case where, yes, there's a correlation. Those initial studies found that the prevalence of XYY males was higher in prison than not. But without a valid hypothesis, without an explanation by those authors of why they thought that would be a correlation they would find, it's just simply chance that that prison population or those few prison populations had of XYY males, which comes back to my now new favorite slide, that per capita consumption of cheese has nothing to do with how frequently you get strangled by your bed sheets, right? If you look at enough data points and data series, as this person did, you find correlations. It doesn't necessarily mean one is related to the other. The other story I want to tell about mitochondria, or not mitochondria, well, yes, mitochondria, genetics and behavior has to do with mitochondrial genetics in this seed beetle. I had to read this paper when I saw it. Look at the title here. The influence of mitonuclear genetic variation on personality in seed beetles. My first question, the reason I had to read this, what do you think? Yeah, what the hell does personality in beetles mean? I didn't pick it up for the genetics. I picked it up to figure out what the hell the title meant. Okay, so in these seed beetles, personality means what happens after they've been attacked or scared or something like that. What does the beetle do? So what these authors did was they took beetles, individual beetle, put it in a petri dish, put the lid on, shake the beetle, put it down on the table. When these beetles are aggressed, they do this behavior called thanatosis, death feigning behavior. They play dead, like opossums do. So then the personality is equivalent to behavior. They wanted to know, what does the beetle do after it undergoes thanatosis, after it plays dead for a while? When it wakes back up, it was never asleep really, but let's be colloquial. When it wakes back up, is it shyer? Does it move less than it normally does? Or does it resume the same level of activity that it did before it was aggressed? Before it got shaken up in a petri dish. Okay, so I want to show you a quick example of thanatosis. And then I'll tell you what they learned. And this is just, I Googled, or I YouTubed thanatosis. I have no idea who produced this video. I just wanted you to see what it looks like.
Touching, tell me it's dead. It's gonna latch on to you. Whoa! Fuck. Whoa! Ooh, I swear to God.
Not any longer than your name. Hardly.
It's really trying to sell the dish. Oh my God!
Right? So this is the personality. They want to know how active is the beetle after it wakes up again. So basically, here are the data. We've got mitochondria, different versions of the mitochondrial genome from 4 different locations, 2 in California, 1 from Brazil, 1 from Yemen. Right? That's these 4 different groups of beetles. And then they just measured the activity. 1.5, the higher value on the y-axis here means relatively inactive. Negative, for some reason, don't ask me why. Negative values are more active. Okay. So the dark filled in symbols, the black circles, black triangles, black squares, those are all females. So they've broken this down by where did your mitochondria come from? What sex are you, and where did your nuclear DNA come from? So we've got 3 different pieces of information all encoded on this graph. So what would you say about females relative to males, generally speaking? How active are the filled in symbols relative to the open symbols? So here's all the black symbols, basically, up here. What activity values do they have? Are they active or inactive? They're relatively inactive. They're on the positive side of the graph. What about males? They're relatively active. Most of their values are negative. So after you shake a male in a petri dish and it wakes up, it just cruises around again like it normally does. And if you shake a female, they basically don't move for a long period after that. So there's a sex-related difference. That's not what they were really interested in, though. They wanted to know about genetic differences between the mitochondria that come from Brazil, California, and Yemen. So let's focus on a single male. Let's look at the Brazilian nuclear genome. So the linear chromosomes, like we've talked about for most of the class. So what we're doing, if we're going to focus on Brazil, is we're going to focus on the circles. So those are the individuals that have Brazilian nuclear genomes. So we've got one here, one there, one there, one there. Those are the activities of different Brazilian seed beetles that have mitochondria that came from different parts of the world. So here's the positive control. Brazilian nuclear DNA with Brazilian mitochondrial DNA, like a seed beetle you would find in Brazil. Relatively active or inactive? It's pretty active. What happens when you give that seed beetle Californian mitochondrial DNA? Well, California 1 DNA, mitochondria anyway, actually make this male less active. What happens if you give it Yemeni mitochondria? Becomes hyperactive. So in this case, the authors conclude that mitochondrial DNA controls personality in seed beetles. So you take the same nuclear genome, you stick different versions of mitochondrial genomes in, and you ask, how does the beetle behave after you shake it? Which hopefully makes you ask the exact same question we looked at earlier. Is this correlation or is it causation? So if you were going to tell me a story of why you thought mitochondria would affect personality in this way in seed beetles, what would your story be? Why is this a valid hypothesis, in other words? That if you change the mitochondria, you will affect personality? What do mitochondria do? They produce ATP.
Maybe because mitochondria is only given by genetics from the mother.
Yeah.
So maybe if there's a correlation between the previous generation and how the other generation behaved and now how this one changed after we gave it a different DNA, you could say that you changed from how it was genetically to what you modified it to, changing its behavior.
Yeah. So this making transgenic beetles, in other words, maybe related to ATP production, maybe some mitochondrial genomes are better able to make ATP than others. Maybe that's directly linked to activity. Maybe you stick really efficient mitochondrial genomes in and you get males that move around a lot more. But if you give them the California 1 mitochondria, like maybe beach bum mitochondria, I don't know. They just like lay around. So, you shake them up, it doesn't bother them, they just don't. So if I could have you take away anything else from this class, it's always ask critical questions. Don't just believe what you hear, especially if it's written like clickbait. One weird new tip to make your beetle undergo thanatosis. Right? Don't fall for it, ask critical questions. So I hope you've enjoyed, I certainly have, as I said at the start, this class. Thank you so much for your attention. I know we've covered a lot of material all related to DNA, and we'll do one more exam on Monday to test you. So, office hours now, happy studying, and it'll all be over soon.